residency with Dr. Wilson Van Dusen. And he was chief psychologist at Mendocino State Hospital in California when he wrote this book, The Presence of Other Worlds, that we're reading from here. So this is what he said. By an extraordinary series of circumstances, a confirmation appears to have been found for one of Emanuel Swedenborg's more unusual doctrines, that man's life depends on his relationship to a hierarchy of spirits. Out of my professional role as a clinical psychologist in a state mental hospital and my own personal interest, I set out to describe as faithfully as possible mental patients' experiences of hallucinations. A discovery 4 years ago helped me to get a relatively rich and consistent picture of the patient's experience. He goes on to say, I found that Swedenborg's system, so Van Dusen became a student of Swedenborg, not only is an almost perfect fit with a patient's experiences, but even more impressively accounts for otherwise quite puzzling aspects of hallucinations. After dealing with hundreds of such patients, I discovered about 4 years ago that it was possible to speak to their hallucinations. To do so, I looked for patients who could distinguish between their own thoughts and the things they heard and saw in the world of hallucinations. I would question these other persons directly, so these hallucinations directly, and instruct the patient to give a word-for-word account of what the voices answered or what was seen. To recap that, because it's a fascinating thing that happened, he was working with people who we would call schizophrenic or psychotic. They could hear voices. And he would, if somebody knew that they were hearing voices and that the voices were something different than their own thoughts, Van Dusen would say, all right, I want to say this to the voices. Now, what do they respond? Because the patient would hear what he said, the voices would respond, and the patient would say it back to Van Dusen. So he could almost have a conversation with the voices the patient were hearing. So that's interesting enough in itself. But to make it even more fascinating, there's actually somebody who's doing this currently right now. And I was able to get him on the phone for an interview. Because he's working currently in these environments, we're just using his first name to protect his identity. So we're going a little underground, I guess. But this is somebody who was actually in contact with Van Dusen later after he'd begun his work. They found each other. But so he's got a really interesting story to tell. And I first asked him about, his name is Jerry, and I asked him, so how did he start into sort of this study of the voices of people? And he interacted with them. He was working in state prisons and mental hospitals, intakes in the ER across like 35 years, a long career of working with people who heard these kind of voices. So this is what he said about how an episode near when he began to investigate the voices that people were hearing.
I remember one patient I was talking to where the voices, he was getting better and better. So this was at the prison, and I figured, okay, well, I don't know what these things are, but what they're telling the patient is consistently negative and self-destructive. What I'm going to do is tell this guy to do the opposite of what they're saying and support him in doing that. So I told him, I said, anytime the voices start telling you negative stuff, you come tap on my window and I'll get you in for an appointment as soon as I can. And we did that, and he was getting better and better and better, and the voices were getting weaker and weaker. And then one day he comes in and he goes, the voices want to talk to you. And they'd never done that before. They'd never talked to me personally. It was always through the patient where they'd say, tell him he's a jerk, or, he's crazy. And, there was always an intermediary. They never asked to speak to me directly. So that took me aback a little bit. And, I went, well, okay, what do they have to say? And I'll never forget these words. They came out and they said, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. And the hair just went up on my back. I mean, our way of life, plural? This wasn't the patient talking, our way of life. And I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? So at that point, I was realizing, hey, this is getting personal. this is, they are aware of me, and they're aware that I'm interfering with what they're doing.
So that's just a very vivid snippet of this long story of how he got involved studying the voices of these patients, and in the same sort of way that Van Dusen did, in talking to the patients and saying, okay, what are your voices saying now? And he learned all these interesting things that they did the ways that they behave that didn't really seem to square with this idea that they're just a chemical accident in the brain of the patients. And so that's just sort of a little tiny preview of his whole long story, where he found out, hey, these things are very goal-oriented, they display similar behaviors, all this stuff. And we'll get into a little of it here, but I hope to have more from him in another program. So during this whole thing, he had this example that he just said to you happened to him, and it sort of freaked him out. He started to look around for what could this be, and that was when he stumbled across Swedenborg, and I asked him about it here.
I think it first happened when I picked up a copy of Heaven and Hell and started reading it. And I'm like, wow, this matches, that matches. It's like, whoa, hey, this guy's come closer to what I've actually experienced with these people than anybody else I've ever read. There was one thing where Swedenborg was talking about spirits, and he says they come to us by turning toward us. They enter our whole memory so completely, it seems though they themselves know everything we know, including languages. And yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that's exactly what I experienced. They can go into a person's memory and pull up every rotten thing they've ever done and rub it in their face until a strong emotional state is created, and then they drain that off.
So that is sort of the specifics he starts to get into there. If we're going to say, oh, I came across Swedenborg, and this surprised me how much it matched what I was finding. What was it? I mean, where did they match up? Where did they line up? And he gave a few interesting examples of specific behaviors of the voices that match Swedenborg's description of evil spirits. And we're going to go through 3 in sequence here, just to kind of show you the correlation and how it goes, and try to thicken the plot as much as possible. So he mentioned it before, this idea that these voices or these entities of some kind can call up things in the memory of the patient and use it against them. So he goes into it more here.
Well, yeah, I've had patients who would tell me that the voices would dredge up stuff from their memory that they had long forgotten. And it's always negative stuff. It's always stuff that's guilt-ridden, shameful. It's always negative. And they just rub it in their faces until they generate a negative emotional state. And virtually everything that the voices tell these schizophrenic patients is negative.
So that is a system he's talking about where there seems to be even that the voices have some kind of memory access that the patients don't have. And the patients, I had forgotten about that. And there's this, and it's not like, sometimes the voices are friendly and sometimes they're not. They're always negative and they're always going at it. And Swedenborg describes this memory thing in a lot of places, including in Secrets of Heaven 751. Evil spirits stir up our falsities and evil as mentioned. From our memory, they stir up everything we have ever considered or committed since childhood. Evil spirits are able to do this with such consummate skill and malice that words cannot describe it. And you'd often get, because you think about being Swedenborg, and you're having these experiences, and no one around you's had something like that. You've never read anything like that, and to just try to say, this is really intense, what's happening here, and I can't put words to it. I can just sense that, the energy of that, trying to communicate something that was so important and so had such an effect on the world and on people. So that's Swedenborg describing evil spirits. That's Jerry describing that. Let's get on to the next one. He had mentioned earlier in a comment this energy drain thing. So I asked him a little more about what energy drain was.
If you talk to these patients, they will tell you, yes, I feel drained of energy, and I can feel the energy being drained and leaving. So apparently what these things do is they create a negative emotional state. And from some other readings I've done is they can't produce this negative emotion themselves, and it's what they feed off of. Once that negative emotional state is generated, then they will drain that energy off, and the patients will say, yeah, I can feel it leaving. And consistently, what's very strange is when you go to bring that up, that these voices are energy parasites, and that they put negative thoughts in your head that generate negative emotional states, and then they drain off that energy. When you go to tell the patient that, the voices get astronomically louder, so they can't even hear you talking. And if you don't know how to shut them up, then you can't get that information through.
So you could say the voices are just biochemical process, but it's very interesting that this process would try to block information about it, that it would somehow know you're telling, and this is not just Jerry came across this once. He's had hundreds of experiences with patients like this. So this energy drain thing, and especially, and the voices seem to even try to cover that fact up. And Swedenborg, in his Journal of Spiritual Experiences, number 4587, he says, when evil spirits are applied, then they induce agony of the spirit by means of tedium, which they increase and inspire continually. And thus they add impatience, which begets the greatest suffering and induces such weakness on the body that the man can scarcely raise himself from bed. This was shown me by this means. When they were present, such a weakness took possession of me, and when they were removed, it ceased, in proportion as they were removed. They also employ many arts so as to infuse weariness and thence weakness. He's almost describing it like, oh, I was doing this experiment, or I was being shown this, like, here you go, this Swedenborg, this is what it feels like, so you can catalog this and write it down. So there you have a couple of specific behaviors that are appearing in both these men's experience. So let's take a look at one more, and this is what I would call the cookie cutter phenomenon.
It's very strange because across physical distances, different institutions, different states, once you go to tell the patient, inform the patient that these things are energy vampires, the voices will say three things consistently, and it's almost like, they're all made it from the same cookie cutter, and I don't understand why this is, but it's very strange. They will, first of all, when you start talking about that, they'll get very loud and try to block out what you're trying to say to the patient. Okay, there are ways to get rid of them, so you get rid of them, shut them up. It's a temporary thing on the most part that allows the patient to hear what you're saying. Right. Number one, the voices will come and say, this guy's crazy, he's full of crap, don't listen to anything he has to say, he's a complete nutcase. Right. If the patient continues to listen, which they do because they see that you know more about these things than they do in a lot of cases, the second thing the voices will say consistently is, get the devil away from him, leave the hospital, leave the office, run out of here, get out. Right. If the patient decides to stay, the third thing they will do is attack him. Right. And they've done that. I had a psychotic Apache pick up a chair and throw it at my head and just barely clip the top of my head. And you can use that against them, because when you go to tell the patient, before you go to tell them, you say, okay, are you hearing the voices now? And they'll say, well, no. And you can say, in 5 minutes, you will be. And this is what they're going to tell you. And you run those factors by and say they'll tell you to, I'm full of crap, get the devil out of here, and attack. And the patient is a little bit horrified. Oh, no, I wouldn't attack you. And I said, well, I know you wouldn't, but they will tell you to, And in 5 minutes, that rolls right off.
So he's saying that he's come across so many of these voices in these patients' head that he can know categories of behavior, and that in different patients, so different brains, in even different institutions, the voices act so similarly that he can catalog that and tell the patients, hey, guess what? When I do this, in 3 minutes, the voices are going to do this. And when the voices start to react like that, that gets the patient's attention. How did you know what the voices are about to do? And you notice there that he's found that strangely enough, the voices will act so similarly. And that's a very weird characteristic to think of, even if you're imagining sort of an evil spirit. Why would they all act the same? And this is something we actually couldn't find in Swedenborg. Just kidding. Why would we put it up here if we couldn't? Okay, this is from Spiritual Experiences 4584. All in hell, however many soever they may be, when viewed in the ordinary light of heaven, appear like each other, and also speak alike, so that you would believe them to be one and the same person, when yet they are innumerable. So this is just to show you that there's some kind of phenomenon that is being described by these three different people, Dr. Wilson Van Dusen, Jerry Swedenborg, as having these same characteristics across a lot of geography and time. And so this is an extreme example of what you might call evil influence. The voices of these schizophrenic patients run their lives and ruin their lives, and a lot of time they'd be in the prison because the voices got them there. However, that's not the principles applied here can apply to more than just schizophrenic patients, more than just the fringe. It's something that can be useful to know about to all of us. Those kinds of things, suddenly these evil spirits didn't have a handhold. And you saw with what Jerry was talking about, the more information he could give the patients on the voices. And when I, other parts of the interview where I talked to him, just knowing, hey, these voices are not me. They're not a part of me. This is something, and they're not helping me. Just to look back over events of their life and see how these things have caused so much problem for you. Just knowing that can make a huge difference. And we're going to get into that a little more in a second, but it's important to see that Swedenborg was able to gain sort of an immunity through knowledge. So we're trying to give you some knowledge here today, this beginnings of knowledge. As with every show, every episode of this show, there's a million things more that I'd like to say on each subject, but we just don't have the time. So this is hopefully to get you started. Obviously, you can go through Swedenborg's books, pull up everything you can find there, but the little bits of knowledge we arm ourselves with help. And so now I'm going to go into some specifics. This is more from my interview with Jerry, where he talked about some practical things that he was doing with these schizophrenic patients to quiet the voices. And we're going to I know we've been talking a lot about people that can hear voices. And you may say, I don't hear voices, so why? There's a connection. And we're going to make it clear within this section of the show. So hang on. In the meantime, be cataloging this information because it's important. So I had asked Jerry, and he said that there's a way you can actually push back against these voices by doing this. And this was part of sort of a system. And so I asked him, so what do you do to get rid of the voices?
Well, I can, but for the most part, it's a temporary thing. If they don't turn their lives around and start asking for spiritual help from a positive direction, that is only going to last for maybe a few hours at the most. There's things they have to do, to keep these things away. Now, in my talks with Van Dusen, who was a Swedenborgian, the first time these things hit and scared the devil out of me, I talked to Frank Rose and said, I need to talk to Van Dusen. And he brought up some experiments that one guy was doing in the 1920s with static electricity. He was actually shocking schizophrenic patients with static electricity, which the voices reported was like a thunderstorm to them. It was like a firestorm. They didn't like it at all, and they would temporarily leave. So at that time I was working in the prison, and I was like, okay, well, how can I duplicate something like that without getting fired? And I was running through all these ideas, and finally I came up with the idea of a big rubber band, because the voices are so enmeshed with the person's thought that a lot of times they can't tell the difference between their thoughts and the voices' thoughts. And the voices don't want them to think there's a difference. They want them to think that they are them. So one of the first things you need to point out is that these are not you. These are different from you. And they will start off very softly, and it's always negative stuff, And, you taught the patient that once you hear these things, you can snap that rubber band, and that I've been told by several patients that it hurts the voices 10 times worse than it hurts them. And that shuts them up temporarily.
So this is just kind of a way he found to help people snap out of it? Was that okay? Okay. All right. So now he talked about static electricity shock. Now that's not like electrocuting somebody to cure them of mental illness. So static electricity, that's a thing you rub your feet on the floor and touch. It doesn't, so he's not talking about that. However, so he found out for some reason you do something like this, snap yourself. It doesn't really hurt you, but there's some kind of connection with the voices where they think, oh my gosh, this is really bad, and it actually stops them from talking for a little while. And as you'll see, it's a sort of a theme. He found there was not only that, there was talk therapy ways. There was information he could give that could get these the voices to stop talking for a little while. However, as you heard, you got to make a positive change. You got to fill that space with positive things, or else the voices will just come back stronger. So we're just taking you sort of through a little list of everything I could get from our interview, where he gives any kind of practical technique. So this is another one having to do with the idea of guardian angels and evil spirits.
Like Swedenborg says, they have two guardians and they have two demonic entities with them. Right? And if they ask specifically, if they ask Christ or their positive guardian angels to shut these things up, they will shut up for some period of time. Right? Now, the voices absolutely hate the 23rd Psalm. They also hate Amazing Grace, that song. So, one thing I tell the patients is even if you have to repeat the 23rd Psalm 1,000 times a day, it's like sticking them with a hot stick. They can't stand it. They can't stand anything positive.
So, can't stand anything positive.
What I just told you just shuts them up, basically, so the patient can ask for spiritual help. And one thing that happens there is that, the voices will make them, when they pray, they'll pray for everybody else and not to get rid of the voices. They have to specifically ask for the voices to be shut up. And it's amazing how hard they find that to be. And moving into what I do, and I'm not the one that does it. I mean, I'm just kind of like the medium for it. And once you start approaching telling the patient that these things are energy vampires, I learned this the hard way. There were a number of times I came back from the prison and the hospitals just completely drained of energy because they were hitting me also. So this is kind of like creeping up on them. You give the patient as much information about them as possible without setting them off. You'll start setting them off when you start telling the patient that they are different from them, that they don't belong to them. And it appears that the voices are shocked that somebody is aware on the outside of their existence, and it takes them a while to kind of reconstitute. So they'll sit there and they'll listen. Where's all this going? Where's all this going? And then once it starts threatening them, then they become active and they start screaming. Okay, so the patient listens to all these different facets of them. They're always negative. They're always telling you lies. They're always trying to create a negative state. They hate your wife. They hate your kids. They're always telling you to do negative stuff. It's consistently negative. And they kind of do to these schizophrenic patients what our military does to prisoners of war. They harass them constantly. Those voices are constantly harassing them.
That's interesting. The military prisoners, that we as humans have figured out a system of how do you really break someone down, make them miserable, and get them to do what you want, and that these negative voices are using the same principles. So where do we get that idea from in the first place? So that's another facet of the experience that Jerry's had, and I want to sort of end the tool section of it with the shortest, most practical one, and it's kind of it's just a variation on that. Remember that thing I was going on and on about only from the word, from these principles. Here's a really simple way to use it, and it's interesting because Swedenborg says that there's sort of two primary good elements, which are love and wisdom, or good and truth. And we've talked about that at length in other episodes of the show. But there's this counter, and the good and truth kind of have this joining together, or this marriage that he says. There's this sort of counter marriage of evil and falsity that Swedenborg calls the hellish marriage, so that everything evil seeks out what is false to go along with it. And that applies right here to how the voices act and the kinds of things that they say.
So you can't trust anything they say. I mean, virtually everything they say about the patient is a lie. So that's one thing the patient can everything they say about themselves, about the patient himself is a lie. When they tell you something negative about yourself, you retort with, that's a lie. You don't hook on to it. Right? Now, that's something patients can do if they can remember to do it.
There you go, and hopefully you can remember to do it. Again, this is not just for schizophrenic patients. This is to your own negative voices in your head. Two more things from Jerry. One, these voices are here. They're in these patients' heads. What do they want?
They want negative energy, right? And they want the destruction of the person. They want them, it appears that they're assigned to destroy that person, okay? And, if you look at the statistics, schizophrenics kill themselves at rates very much higher than general population psychiatric patients. And I think that's mostly because of the voices. And they're, lots of times they're telling them, kill yourself. Nobody loves you, nobody likes you, you're a waste, kill yourself.
So there's nothing, like no warm and fuzzy, no limits to the voices and how they act and the kind of negativity they want to bring into people and have those people act out on the world. And I've been saying it's worth the rest of us learning about that, and here's where he ties it together.
They need to realize that every negative thought put in their mind is put in by them, by these evil things, and not to dwell on it, and these are things that everybody can, needs to live by. I mean, we're talking about these evil thoughts, but everybody experiences them, and schizophrenics are like the top 10% of the normal curve. So it's much more obvious there. Where it becomes obvious with the normal person is with intrusive thoughts, where, you're standing on top of a bridge and you hear a thought saying, hey, what would it be like to jump? Or, some horrible intrusive thought comes in like, oh, why don't you murder this guy? Or why don't you kill, it's just some horrible thing that comes in and you go, where did that come from? It's not you. It's nothing you would ever have done. It's nothing you would even want to consider. But here comes this intrusive thought, and you go, whoa, that's horrible. Where did that come from? That's them, and that's what it's like. So they're attracted to negative emotion like sharks are attracted to blood. And they're constantly derogatory. They instill doubt, guilt, fear, anxiety.
So, you may not have heard voices, but doubt, fear, guilt, anxiety.
It's also critical to understand that these things sound just like your own thoughts. They don't sound any different. There's not a timbre, there's not a voice change, there's nothing like that. It's the intent of the thought, and that becomes most clear with people who, everybody's experienced it, where you're walking down the sidewalk and all of a sudden you get this intensely negative, horrifying thought, and it just seems to come out of nowhere, and you're kind of going, where'd that come from? It's like it's nothing you would ever do, it's nothing you would ever consider, and you're horrified by it. It's not your own thought. I talked to one nurse one time about this, and she said she was walking up the garage where multiple floors, and she looked over the railing and she had a thought saying, jump. Why don't you jump? And stuff like that. That's where they operate clearest in normal people. But where they become very clear, and where psychiatry has led everybody down the wrong path, is with the psychotic voices that schizophrenics hear.